say before I hand this over to Sheldon is a question actually for everybody. Who has read Ernest Becker's books? Please raise your hand. Okay, very, very, very interesting. Well, for all of those who have not experienced the wisdom and insight of Ernest Becker, you're going to be in for a big surprise because unfortunately Ernest can't be here this evening, but Sheldon is like his son. The only other thing I would like to say is to thank Western Washington University for co-sponsoring the event, and also the Ernest Becker Foundation from Seattle is a very significant co-sponsor, and they have a table outside and they have some of their material, and if you're interested on the way out, maybe you can take a look at some of their propaganda. Anyway, that's it, and here's Sheldon, and thank you for coming, and wow, what a great turnout.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everybody for coming. I can't see you that well because of the lights, so I'm going to assume that you're out there. I'm frankly amazed and impressed that so many folks would come out on a Monday evening at this time, and it's a testament, I think, to the quality of your town and the university, and I'm very much honored to be here to talk a little bit tonight about the work of Ernest Becker. I'm an experimental social psychologist by trade, and I teach at Skidmore College in upstate New York. But for the last 30 years or so, I've been studying the work of Ernest Becker and conducting experiments in a variety of settings to demonstrate that from a scientific perspective that many of his ideas about the nature of human behavior have scientific merit. What I'd like to do tonight is just to give you an overview of Becker's ideas as they relate to some of the difficulties that I think human beings are presently encountering, hence the subtitle of the presentation, Humanity at the Crossroads. We actually titled the lecture, Afraid of the Dark, Humanity at the Crossroads. And Ernest Becker in the 1970s was concerned about some aspects of human affairs that I think are equally pertinent today as they were at the time that he first mused about them. And I want to talk about three potential difficulties that humans now currently confront. One is just man's proverbial inhumanity to man. I know Jim asked if anybody has read Becker's books. Who's taken a shot at James Joyce's Ulysses? Has anybody tried that one? Do you remember about page 9 of that book, which is as far as I got for 40 years? The main character, Stephen Dedalus, says, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken." And in many ways, that kind of sums it up. Even the most benevolent glance at human history reveals an ongoing succession of genocidal atrocities punctuated by the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors. And people like Robert J. Lifton, the psychohistorian, they just say when you add to that the current proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, that human beings may have the ignominious distinction of being the first form of life that renders ourselves extinct. And so I think one of the problems that confront us right now is just whether or not we can come to terms with humankind's long-standing disinclination to tolerate other people who don't share our views about the nature of reality. Another problem that Becker was concerned with just has to do with the psychological well-being of people in our culture. One kind of glib way to put it is that America is a petri dish of psychopathology. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, over half of the citizens in our country are either currently or will be depressed in their lifetime, addicted to drugs or alcohol, or victims of some kind of anxiety disorder, either phobias or social anxiety. Another problem that I'm sure you're all painfully aware of has to do with the fact that human beings are rapidly rendering the planet upon which we reside unfit for human habitation. Although this is, as you know, very hotly contended these days in political circles, I would argue at the risk of being provocative that only the willfully ignorant and intellectually dormant will deny oh, this is nice. All right, I'm not used to this kind of surroundings. I come from upstate New York, and I would not have made it through that sentence without people charging the stage to tear my heart out and show it to me while it's still beating before I died. Needless to say, though, I think most of us can agree that human-induced climate change will either change the nature of the planet upon which we reside, or if we believe folks like Bill McKibben, has already changed the planet in ways that have made it very much inhospitable, not only to human beings, but other forms of life. And I became interested in Ernest Becker's work in 1980 when I was a brand new professor at Skidmore College. And what attracted me to Becker's ideas was that he had a very keen way of thinking about the motivational underpinnings of human behavior that enabled him, in my opinion, to be able to address all of these issues in a very cogent and very impactful fashion. Becker was a cultural anthropologist, and in the 1970s he wrote some tremendously important books, and there's three that I'll make reference to this evening: The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, for which Becker won the Pulitzer Prize, and then another book called Escape from Evil. And what Becker said basically is, if we want to understand these kinds of difficulties, we need to step back and to ask a more basic motivational question, and that is, why do people do what they do when they do it? And I don't know, I'm going to guess that you are a very educated audience, and who's has a college degree or a graduate degree, and who's read either journal articles or turgid academic books that are so laden with jargon that they're non-pharmacological interventions for insomnia. One of the things that I liked about Becker when I first read his books was just the crisp prose that I found immediately engaging and demanding of one's attention. This is in the first paragraph of The Birth and Death of Meaning. Why do people do what they do when they do it? And I was hooked. He just had a way of cutting to the chase. And he said, moreover, that if we're to get workable solutions to these difficulties, he said, you know, before we even get started, I want to establish some epistemological guidelines. And there were four of them that he asked us to think about. And one of them is just that these are big questions, and big questions require broad inquiry. Long before it was fashionable to do so, Becker emphasized the importance of interdisciplinary inquiry. He just said that no discipline has a lock on the truth, and if we're going to tackle big questions, it would be ill-advised to ignore ideas from any academic or even non-academic discourse. So while he was trained as an anthropologist, he relies heavily on biology, on anthropology, of course, and sociology, psychology, theology, philosophy, popular culture. He just said it ought to be a big tent, and we should respectfully and carefully entertain ideas from wherever they come. On the other hand, he turned right around and he said, well, you know, we do need to consider every idea, but not all ideas are created equal. You have a right to your ideas, and you have a right to be wrong. Some ideas are better than others, and if he were here today, I think he would take ardent issue with some of our current feelings that every idea is as good as another. He was very much insistent that we subject our ideas to empirical scrutiny, not so much because the scientific method is capable of obtaining the truth, but rather because it's a ruthlessly effective way to discard that which is untrue. And then his third argument was that we should use what we learn about the psychological underpinnings of human behavior in order to improve the human condition. I see that a lot of you in the audience are roughly my age, give or take a few decades on either side, which that's to include everybody here. And I would say that he was most assuredly, in the best sense of the word, a child of the Enlightenment. Just the idea that properly deployed, we can use what we learn about ourselves not only to improve our own lives, but the lives of the people around us. And then finally, Becker said, I think we're going to make the best headway if we start by grounding our ideas in Darwin's theory of evolution. Once again, long before it was fashionable to do so, Becker anticipated. It took 50 years almost for contemporary psychologists to catch up to where Becker was in the 1960s, when he said it would behoove us to use evolutionary theory as a foundation for inquiry about the basic nature of the human animal. And so with that in mind, let's just get started. In order to get going, all we need to do is to start with the relatively non-controversial Darwinian assumption that human beings share with all forms of life a basic biological predisposition towards self-preservation in the service of survival and reproduction. Good, see, just that I was able to say that, it is a great indication that things will go well today, because in many states we would not get through that sentence, but that's very good. And to put it another way, more pithily, living things like to stay alive, and I think we can agree on that. But as Darwin noted, though, and I do think this is important, all forms of life strive to stay alive, but over literally billions of years of evolutionary time, different forms of life have devised a whole host of physical and behavioral and psychological adaptations in the service of the most arduous task of perpetuating themselves over time. And so some silly examples. The cactus is not a particularly cerebral or mobile entity, but the ability to store water, and the needles or thorns that keep predators away are very effective. The bat doesn't see that well, but they've got fairly good acoustic capabilities, and that enables them to get around, and so on and so forth. The skunk stinks, which has done nothing for my social life, but the skunk has parlayed that into a successful form of life over literally millions of years. So what about people? And Darwin observed that people are a paradoxical species of sorts, because from a purely physical point of view, it's really not clear why we're even alive. After all, we're not very large and we're not very fast. Our senses aren't that keen. We don't see that well. We don't hear that well. We don't have sharp teeth or claws. And so, well, why are we here? And Darwin answered that question. He was a pretty smart guy, by the way. He said, there's two reasons why people are here. One is that we're highly gregarious. We're very social creatures. And the other is that we're frighteningly intelligent creatures. And so, on the one hand, none of us could survive by ourselves, by virtue of our physical attributes. But luckily we don't have to. Because we're social creatures, we can cooperate with each other in the service of constructing and maintaining a host of elaborate institutions that can facilitate our collective survival, which is just a fancy way of saying we can't make it on our own, but we don't need to. Together we can build roads and schools and hospitals and Starbucks and Domino's and all the things that make life better for most of us most of the time. Not only that, but as I'm sure you're all aware of, we are a very highly intelligent form of life. Although I must say, if we had more time, I would argue that intelligence is vastly overrated unless it's complemented with other moral sensibilities. Be that as it may, however, when Becker thinks about human beings being smart, this is not to suggest that other creatures are not. Anyone who has pets know that they can be darn clever. But there's a particular kind of intelligence that Becker wants us to ponder, and that is the rather sublime ability of human beings, by virtue of our capacity for abstract and symbolic thought, to literally conceive of or imagine things that do not yet exist, and then to have the audacity to transform our dreams into reality. One of Freud's disciples, Otto Rank, has a very lovely phrase. He just says that only human beings make the unreal real. And I think that's just lovely. And some of you know this. Help me out so that you can do some of the work also. Who was doodling little pictures of helicopters in his notebooks in the 1500s? Good, Da Vinci. And what did people say at the time? Good, you are crazy, but isn't it amazing that today we are routinely transported by what was originally dismissed as the doodlings of a madman? And can we agree that these two attributes, that we're very social creatures and that we have the capacity to alter the world in accordance with our desires. Some of you are probably old enough to remember Nancy Reagan, just say no. And I like that phrase, only human beings. If we don't, all other creatures must accept the world in the form in which they encounter it. Only human beings can just say no to reality, conjure up an image of how they would prefer it to be, and transform it in according with those desires. And I just think that it's very obvious that that's one of the reasons why we have proliferated over all of the earth from a very small band of original humans from a single neighborhood in southeastern Africa.